In the year 1415, a man walked toward his death, singing hymns, his voice rising above the crackling flames that would soon consume him. Jean Hus, a Czech priest who dared to challenge the most powerful institution of his time, had been promised safe conduct by an emperor and protection by the Holy Roman Empire itself. Yet, as the fire engulfed his body, those promises turned to ash along with his flesh. His execution would not silence his message. Instead, it would ignite a revolution that would shake the foundations of medieval Europe and echo through the centuries to our modern world. The early 15th century was a time of profound upheaval in Christian Europe. The Catholic Church, once the unquestioned spiritual authority, found itself mired in scandal and division. The Great Schism had torn the papacy apart, with multiple men claiming to be the true pope simultaneously. Corruption festered at every level of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, from village priests demanding payment for sacraments to cardinals living in luxury while peasants starved. The church had grown fat on indulgences, essentially selling salvation to the highest bidder. Many faithful Christians began to question whether this institution truly represented the teachings of Christ. Into this turbulent world stepped Jean Hus, born around 1370 in the small Bohemian village of Husinec. The son of peasants, Hus clawed his way up through education and ordination, eventually becoming a master at Charles University in Prague and rector of the Bethlehem Chapel. But unlike many of his contemporaries who sought comfort in ecclesiastical positions, he became increasingly disturbed by what he witnessed. He saw priests who could barely read Latin stumbling through masses, bishops who accumulated multiple benefices while neglecting their flocks, and a papal court that seemed more concerned with political power than spiritual salvation. The disconnect between the Church's teachings about humility and poverty and its actual practices of wealth accumulation and political manipulation became impossible for him to ignore. Hus found inspiration in the writings of John Wycliffe, an English theologian who had argued that the Bible, not the Pope, should be the ultimate authority in matters of faith. Wycliffe had been declared a heretic, but his ideas had spread throughout Europe like wildfire among those hungry for reform. Hus began preaching in Czech rather than Latin, making his sermons accessible to common people who had been excluded from understanding their own religion. He proclaimed that salvation came through faith in Scripture, not through purchasing indulgences or following papal decrees. He argued that the Church should return to apostolic poverty, and that corrupt priests lost their authority through their sin. His sermons drew massive crowds to the Bethlehem Chapel, where merchants, artisans, and nobles alike gathered to hear this radical message. But with popularity came danger. The local archbishop and clergy, threatened by Hus's growing influence and his challenges to their authority, began pressuring him to cease his preaching. When Hus refused, they turned to Pope John XXII, one of 3 men claiming the papal title during the Great Schism, who issued a papal bull forbidding Hus from preaching. Still, Hus continued arguing that he must obey God rather than corrupt men, even if they wore papal robes. The situation escalated rapidly when Hus publicly opposed the Pope's sale of indulgences to fund a crusade against rival papal claimants. This was not merely a theological dispute. It was a direct challenge to the Church's financial foundation and political authority. Hus was excommunicated, and Prague was placed under interdict, meaning no religious services could be performed in the city as long as he remained there. Rather than submit, Hus left Prague to protect his followers, spending 2 years writing and preaching in the Bohemian countryside, where support only grew stronger among the common people. The crisis came to a head in 1414, when the Council of Constance convened to address the Great Schism and reform the Church. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, eager to bring unity to his fractured empire, personally invited Hus to attend the council and defend his teachings. Most crucially, Sigismund granted Hus a document of safe conduct, promising him protection from arrest or harm during his journey to and from Constance and during his time there. This was not merely a formality. Safe conduct documents were considered sacred obligations that bound the honor of the issuing authority. For an emperor to violate such a promise would be to destroy his credibility and trustworthiness in the intricate web of medieval diplomacy. Hus initially hesitated, knowing the dangers that awaited him in Constance. His friends and supporters begged him not to go, sensing a trap. But Hus felt compelled by his conscience and his faith to defend his teachings before the assembled representatives of Christendom. He believed that truth would prevail, that his arguments from Scripture would convince reasonable men, and that the emperor's safe conduct would protect him. On October 11th, 1414, accompanied by Bohemian nobles and carrying Sigismund's promise of protection, Jan Hus would never see his homeland again. His trust in imperial honor would prove to be a fatal miscalculation that would cost him everything. Upon arriving in Constance on November 3rd, 1414, he initially moved freely throughout the city, preaching in private homes and meeting with supporters. The safe conduct seemed to be holding, and he wrote optimistic letters back to Prague describing his reception. However, the council's agenda quickly became clear. This was not to be a theological debate, but a tribunal. On November 28th, barely 3 weeks after his arrival, Hus was arrested on the orders of the cardinals and Pope John XXI, despite Sigismund's safe conduct. When Emperor Sigismund protested this violation of his guarantee, he was told by the council that promises made to heretics were not binding and that the church's authority superseded imperial safe conduct. Hus was imprisoned in a Dominican monastery under horrific conditions. The cell was barely large enough for him to lie down, located next to a latrine that filled his cramped quarters with noxious fumes. The stench was so overwhelming that it made him violently ill, yet his captors showed no mercy. For months, he was denied adequate food, proper medical care, and even basic sanitation. His health deteriorated rapidly under these conditions, but his spirit remained unbroken. He spent his time in prayer and writing letters to his followers, encouraging them to remain faithful to the gospel truth regardless of what happened to him. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice, predetermined in its outcome, and designed to humiliate rather than examine truth. Hus was presented with a list of articles, supposedly extracted from his writings and sermons, many of which had been taken out of context or distorted beyond recognition. When he attempted to explain his actual positions or provide scriptural support for his teachings, he was shouted down by hostile cardinals and bishops who had no interest in genuine theological discussion. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, making it difficult for supporters in the audience to follow, while Hus was frequently interrupted and prevented from mounting a coherent defense. The council demanded that Hus recant all of his teachings and submit completely to papal authority. They offered him life imprisonment rather than death if he would simply admit error and beg forgiveness. But he refused to compromise his conscience or betray what he believed to be biblical truth. "I would not, for a chapel full of gold, receive from the truth," he declared to his accusers. He argued that he could not recount teachings he had never held, and that he would not deny scriptural truth simply to save his earthly life. His steadfast refusal to bend, even in the face of certain death, both frustrated and enraged the council members who had expected him to cave under pressure. As the trial dragged on to the winter and spring of 1415, Hus's supporters in Bohemia grew increasingly agitated. Petitions arrived at the council signed by hundreds of Bohemian nobles demanding his release and threatening consequences if he was harmed. These threats only strengthened the council's resolve to make an example of him. They understood that allowing Hus to return to Bohemia alive, even if silenced, would be seen as a victory for his cause and would encourage other reformers throughout Europe to challenge church authority with impunity. The final session of Hus's trial took place on July 6, 1415, in the Cathedral of Constance before an assembly of cardinals, bishops, abbots, and secular authorities. One last time, the council offered him the chance to save his life through complete recantation. Hus arose to address the assembly, his body weakened by months of imprisonment, but his voice clear and resolute. He declared that he had always sought to preach only what was supported by Scripture, that he had never intended to create division within the church, and that he could not in good conscience deny teachings that he believed to be true. "God is my witness that I have never taught or preached what false witnesses have testified against me," he proclaimed. When it became clear that Hus would not recant, the council pronounced him a heretic and handed him over to the secular authorities for execution. As was customary, they performed a ritual degradation, stripping him of his priestly vestments piece by piece. While reading out his condemnation, they placed a paper crown on his head decorated with images of demons and inscribed with the word heretic. Throughout this humiliation, Hus maintained his dignity, praying quietly and showing no sign of fear or regret. Emperor Sigismund, who had promised him safe conduct, was present during these proceedings but said nothing to intervene. He was immediately taken to a field outside the city walls where a pyre had been prepared. A crowd of thousands had gathered to witness the execution, including many of the council members who wanted to see their sentence carried out. The executioner offered Huss one final opportunity to save his life by recanting, but he refused. "Today you burn a goose," he said, referring to his name, which meant goose in Czech. "But in a century you will hear a swan sing whom you will not be able to silence." This prophecy would prove remarkably prescient, as exactly 102 years later, Martin Luther would begin the Protestant Reformation that would finally shatter the Catholic Church's monopoly on Western Christianity. As the flames were lit, Huss began singing hymns in Latin, his voice carrying clearly across the field. "Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me," he sang, even as the fire began to consume his clothing and flesh. Witnesses reported that he continued singing until the smoke became too thick and the flames too intense for him to continue. Some claimed they could see his lips moving in prayer, even after his voice was silenced. The fire burned for hours until nothing remained but ashes, which were then scattered into the River to prevent his followers from collecting relics. News of Huss's execution reached Bohemia within days and sparked immediate outrage. The nobility felt betrayed by Sigismund's failure to honor his safe conduct, while common people saw Huss as a martyr who had died for preaching the simple truth of the gospel. Protests erupted throughout Bohemia, and many churches began conducting services according to Huss's reforms rather than papal requirements. When the council attempted to fill Huss's position at the Bethlehem chapel with a Catholic loyalist, the congregation rioted and drove the replacement away. The anger in Bohemia soon transformed into open rebellion against both church and imperial authority. The Hussite Wars, which would rage for the next 2 decades, saw Czech forces repeatedly defeat crusading armies sent by the Pope and Emperor. These wars were among the first in European history to be fought primarily over religious principles rather than territorial or dynastic claims. The Hussites developed innovative military tactics, including the use of war wagons and early firearms that would influence European warfare for generations. Their success proved that papal authority could be successfully challenged by force of arms, encouraging other reform movements throughout Europe. The execution of Jan Hus became a rallying cry not just for Czech nationalism, but for religious reform throughout Europe. His writings, smuggled out of prison and distributed widely, inspired reformers from England to Hungary. The printing press, invented shortly after his death, allowed his ideas to spread faster and farther than ever before. When Martin Luther began posting his challenges to Catholic authority in 1517, he explicitly acknowledged his debt to Huss and other early reformers who had paid for their courage with their lives. The betrayal of Huss's safe conduct had profound implications for medieval concept of honor and political reliability. Emperor Sigismund's failure to protect Huss damaged his credibility throughout the Holy Roman Empire and contributed to the political fragmentation that would plague Central Europe for centuries. The principle that promises of heretics were not binding undermined the entire system of diplomatic immunity and safe conduct that had made medieval negotiations possible. Future reformers would never again trust in imperial or papal guarantees, knowing that religious authorities had proven willing to break their most solemn oaths when it served their purposes. The Catholic Church's treatment of Huss also established a pattern of dealing with reform movements through violence rather than theological engagement that would characterize its response to challenges for the next century. Rather than addressing the legitimate criticisms that Huss and others raised about corruption and abuse, church authorities chose to silence critics through intimidation, imprisonment, and execution. This approach only served to convince more people that the church had abandoned its spiritual mission in favor of protecting its temporal power and wealth. Modern historians recognize Jan Hus as one of the most significant figures in the transition from medieval to early modern Europe. His emphasis on biblical authority over papal decree, his insistence on preaching in the vernacular language rather than Latin, and his criticism of clerical corruption all prefigured the major themes of the Protestant Reformation. His willingness to die rather than compromise his convictions inspired countless others to stand up against religious tyranny and corruption. The University of Oxford historian Dermot McCulloch has called Huss the first Protestant martyr. Czech historians regard him as both a religious reformer and a national hero who defended Czech identity against German imperial domination. The story of Jan Hus reveals the deadly consequences that await those who challenge entrenched power with nothing but truth as their weapon. His trust in imperial promises and his faith in rational theological discourse proved naive in the face of institutions willing to use any means necessary to preserve their authority. Yet his death accomplished what his life could not. It exposed the moral bankruptcy of his opponents and inspired a revolution that would ultimately achieve many of the reforms he had advocated. In our own time, when religious and political authorities still claim divine sanction for their actions, Huss's example reminds us that individual conscience sometimes demands resistance to corrupt authority, regardless of the personal cost. The flames that consumed Jan Hus in 1415 lit a fire that the Catholic Church could never fully extinguish. His execution transformed him from a troublesome priest into a martyr whose memory would inspire generations of reformers. The promise of safe conduct that was broken with him became a symbol of how power corrupts even the most sacred obligations. As we reflect on his story 6 centuries later, we must ask ourselves, what promises are being broken in our own time? And what truths are we called to defend regardless of the consequences?